It's called the Auschwitz of the Balkans. The Jasenovac extermination camp was one of the largest concentration camps on European soil during the Second World War. Monster book, monster I say in both senses of the word, because it's enormous and because the details in here are truly horrific. Thank you for joining us. I have to confess to my own ignorance and say that before we had you on the show, I hadn't heard of the Jasenovac extermination camp. How is it possible that such massive, systematic, industrialized brutality was kept covered up for so long?
It's mostly due to the politics of Tito, who wanted to unite the various countries who consisted Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and one of the methods of unity was to wipe out the past, and the past was too problematic for the people of Yugoslavia, so they had to forget about Jasenovac and other horrible crimes which were perpetrated.
So what are we talking about then with Jasenovac? A camp that, who did it house? How did they kill them? Why?
It's not one camp, it's a chain of camps. It's an empire of dozens of camps. The most notorious one was Jasenovac, but there were many others in which hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Jews, Sinti and Roma and other innocent victims were brutally, really brutally murdered by 57 methods of killing, which I am describing in the book. So almost 1 million innocent people were brutally murdered between 1941 and 1945. Only April 45, this horrible camp was liberated.
And of course, most of the victims were not Jews. We're not talking about a classic Holocaust extermination camp, but a different attempt at extermination.
Different, but nevertheless, 40,000 ex-Yugoslav Jews were murdered there, mostly Jews from Serbia and Croatia.
So when you say 57 methods of killing, I mean, we don't want to get too graphic, but...
Better not.
But a little bit about what we know, please.
Burning you alive, cutting your head with axes, etc., etc.
I mean, it's a horrific legacy, and I wonder to what extent modern-day Croatia, a democratic country, member of the European Union, has faced up to that past and responsibility for the perpetrators.
Did not and doesn't want to. This is a tragedy within the tragedy. The Croats deny or try to deny the truth, to minimize the number of victims, to present a false picture of that camp. And I think as long as they are not admitting the truth, how will they educate new generations?
And is there any sort of political pressure, either from Jewish communities or local people in Croatia, to say it's time to open up this historic chapter and come to terms with it?
There is a big pressure from outside and from inside, even from inside intellectuals in Croatia. But until now, all this is in vain. And I have to admit that I myself got not less than 9 threats for my life from Croatians all over the world.
Of Croat nationalists who are furious.
To stop my researches and to leave this subject aside. Of course, I'm not frightened.
So what happened in the end to the Jasenovac extermination camp? How did it meet its end?
At the end of the war, it was liberated, and unfortunately, most of the criminals never paid for their crimes. They ran away, they escaped, they died naturally in their beds. And this is extremely frustrating.
And what's extraordinary about this is we're not talking about a regime that was simply doing the bidding of the Germans. We're talking about local Croats acting out of presumably some form of Croat nationalism.
That's true. On the other hand, they imitated Nazi Germany. They adopted a very similar ideology. The Ustashism is like Nazism, like National Socialism. They were like brothers, like twins for Nazi Germany. Ante Pavelic, the leader, the Führer of Croatia, went very often to Berlin to learn more new systems, so they were very close ideologies.
And how much influence did the Germans have? I mean, was this just inspiration to commit horrific acts, or were they closely coordinated? What was the actual Nazi involvement here?
Everything what you have mentioned, but I have to emphasize that Jasenovac's chain of camps was operated exclusively by the Croats. The Germans visited there, were impressed by it, but even complained that the Croats were too brutal to their taste.
The Germans complained that the Croats were being too brutal.
It sounds funny, but yes.
It sounds unbelievable.
Let me give you one example. General von Kleistenau in 1942 visited Jasenovac and wrote a report in which he complained that the methods which he found in Jasenovac were too barbaric, too extreme. Can you imagine?
Extraordinary. You mentioned that Marshal Tito had a very keen interest to hush this up in the interest of Yugoslav, in the interest of Yugoslav reunification. But what about historians? Why did historians not give this greater prominence?
I think they adapted themselves to the general policy. There were some publications about Jasenovac, but they didn't get the real attention which they should have. And the unique I think the unique line of this book is that it's a mixture of an historical research, authentic, accurate, and being popular in the good sense of the word. So you don't have to be educated or academic to read it and get the real impression.
Not educated, but perhaps a weightlifter, because this is enormous. Dr. Greif,